Okay. So, okay, I think it's your name. Hi, everyone. My name is Katy Maldonado Dominguez. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate in American Studies at Yale University. Today, I'll be a co-facilitator for the talk today with Nancy Escalante, who will be facilitating discussion questions at the end of the talk. But I'll start off with a small introduction of who we are and what we're planning to do today. But thank you for joining us. So we're a group of Central American graduate students at Yale that are working to build a Central American Studies intellectual community on campus, but also on the East Coast. And this book talk is part of our ongoing efforts to highlight important and new work on Central Americans and engage in public dialogue with one another. So we want to establish some guidelines before we get started, now that we have that introduction. So this will be, again, a recorded event. Please turn off your cameras or change your name if you're not comfortable with showing up in the recording. I'm going to ask everyone to mute their microphones to eliminate background noise. And again, Nancy will be taking questions for the Q&A portion. So send your questions directly or privately to her throughout the duration of the discussion, and then we'll moderate that and share questions in the chat during the Q&A portion. We hope that this kind of will leave the chat as a space to have some real-time discussion. And then finally, as Central Americans in the diaspora within the US, we've made it to a sort of place in which a number of us can have the opportunity to even have this talk, to research and write about our own stories, experiences, and histories. So our goal here is to build community, but also intentionally foster a space in which we can critically discuss and think about issues that are related to Central American experiences. So just be mindful of this when you're engaging with the discussion, but also when you're kind of formulating your questions. And with that, I'll introduce the amazing Yajaira Padilla, who is the focus of our talk today. So Yajaira Padilla is a professor of English and Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Arkansas, as well as director of the Latin American and Latino Studies program. She received her PhD in literature from the University of California, San Diego in 2005. Her research centers on Central American cultural and literary studies and Central Americans in a US, Latinx, Latina, Latino context. She's the author of Changing Women, Changing Nation, Female Agency, Nationhood and Identity in Trans-Salvadoran Narratives, and has published articles in Latin American Perspectives, Latino Studies, the Arizona Journal of Hispanic Cultural Studies, and Studies in 20th and 21st Century Literature, among other journals. Her new book and the focus of this book talk is titled From Threatening Guerillas to Forever Illegals, U.S. Central Americans and the Cultural Politics of Non-Belonging, available through UT Press, which interrogates the hegemonic means of imagining and representing Central Americans in the United States from the 1980s through 2018. So with that, I'll open up the floor to Yajaira, who will enlighten us on her new book.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Katy. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody that's joining us today on this, summer afternoon, particular all of you that have taken time, and also some of my colleagues that I see from the University of Arkansas. I'm grateful to have you here as well. I wanted to thank, before I begin, Katy Maldonado and the Yale Central American Studies group, all of you for making this possible and taking the time to reach out and do this. As a U.S. Central American myself, or Salvadoran American or Salvi growing up, how I wish I would have had these opportunities in the same way. I did have them, but it was different. We had to find each other in conferences and small spaces. And I also want to thank the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, who co-sponsored the event. As I mentioned to Katy and the group present, I have not mastered the skill of being able to speak without reading just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and read my talk with a couple of interjections in between. It is taken from portions of the book, particularly the introduction and the first chapter, but I do have images. So hopefully if you're already read, those parts, this won't seem as, as kind of boring to you if you already read the book. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And that way we can go ahead and start the presentation. Okay, I'm hopeful that everybody can see it. Okay, so basically the book talk is titled the same as the major title of the book, U.S. Central Americans and the Politics of Non-Belonging, slightly abbreviated. Within the span of the last 4 decades, a period bracketed by the 2 conservative presidencies of Ronald Reagan and that of Donald Trump, Central Americans in and outside of the isthmus have factored in the U.S. popular imaginary in very specific ways. During the 1980s and the height of the Central American Revolutionary period, prominent depictions of Central Americans in political discourse, news media, literature, film, and other mediums consisted primarily of menacing guerrillas or military strongmen and their correlative war-torn political refugees. Existent beyond these renditions are those of the Central American youth gang member, the maid or domestica, and what I term the forever illegal, a composite of sorts that speaks to newer waves of migrants marked by their enduring liminal legality or majority unauthorized status. Direct descendants of the former, these latter manifestations have emerged in the consecutive decades of the 1990s and early 2000s and brandish a similar symbolic power and weight over the U.S. public's perceptions of U.S. Central Americans, particularly undocumented populations. Although these figures are ones that bear the imprint of well-known cliches and stereotypes associated more broadly with the Latin American region, its peoples, and Latinx populations in the United States, they also remain bound to and are the byproduct of specific U.S. Central American histories, geopolitical contexts, and immigrant realities. The trope of, quote, illegality, for example, is one that has long been associated with brown bodies, especially that of Mexicans. Indeed, as Leo Chavez maintains, the Mexican is the, quote, quintessential illegal. Yet, as the Central American inflections of the forever illegal show, how these racialized bodies come to be, quote, illegal and inhabit such a precarious condition are not all the same. The ways that U.S. Central Americans exist within and in relation to regimes of immigrant illegality are conditioned by their nationalities and histories of immigrant reception in the United States. Such prevalent representations of U.S. Central Americans, immigrants, and subsequent generations alike, and their critical possibilities in relation to what I term non-belonging, are a central focus of my research and writing of the last several years, culminating in my book, From Threatening Guerillas to Forever Illegals. Non-belonging is a concept that I employ to register both the ways in which U.S. Central Americans have been constituted as unbelonging others on a symbolic and material level, and the related means by which these same populations and others affirm, unsettle, and counteract this exclusionary condition. Rooted in Latin America's colonial legacy and Central America's peripheral status within Latin America proper, this condition and sense of marginalization is likewise exacerbated for many Central American immigrants within the context of labor exploitation, social and racial stratification, and anti-immigrant policies and sentiments in the United States. Non-belonging likewise underscores the limits of narrowly conscripted notions and discourses of national affiliation based on citizenry, social and economic integration, and affect, whilst also allowing for a broader understanding of the alternative forms of individual and communal belonging U.S. Central Americans enact within the context of the diasporic and/or the transnational or transisthmian. It is these politics of non-belonging that undergird the emergent U.S. Central American experience of the last 4 decades, and which I ultimately argue the noted hegemonic depictions of U.S. Central Americans actively engage and make discernible. During the 1980s, the unprecedented influx of Central American refugees, primarily from El Salvador and Guatemala, drastically changed Central American U.S. migration patterns, thereby laying the foundation for the vibrant U.S. Central American communities that exist and continue to grow today. And here, I'm not implying that Central Americans have not been migrating to the U.S. or haven't existed in different ways, but I'm kind of looking at the 1980s as this kind of pivotal, transformative point. This moment also marks a pivotal originating point for the legal, social, and economic battles vast members of these communities have faced and are continue to do so. The Reagan administration's interventionist efforts in Central America to combat the threat of communism influenced and negatively impacted the prospects of political asylum for most of the Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees that sought safe harbor in the United States. At the same time, pursuing legal residency through alternate means was made extremely difficult for these immigrants. Legislation such as the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, otherwise known as Reagan's Amnesty Law, was only applicable to immigrants who met certain standards and who arrived prior to 1982. excluding more than half of the Guatemalan and Salvadoran population, which arrived afterward. Related immigration measures gave way to similar uneven opportunities and results. As Cecilia Menjivar notes, in 1992, and following intense lobbying by immigration groups, the U.S. government began granting Salvadorans who had arrived prior to 1990 temporary protected status, TPS. The program was afforded to Salvadorans, giving them a provisional reprieve from deportation due to the violent conflict in El Salvador and their inability to return, but Guatemalan refugees were not provided the same opportunity. In the decades since, and as subsequent waves of migration from the Isthmus have continued to fuel the growth of U.S. Central American communities, similar discriminatory and restrictive foreign and domestic policies have been implemented, adding to the legal and civic disenfranchisement of large sectors of these populations. And I'll talk about, the Trump era policies later in a separate slide, but I do want to, put that in there. Indeed, as Cecilia Menjivar and Lacey Abrego have noted, U.S. Central Americans have been routinely subjected to multiple forms of legal violence. Inherent to this type of systemic oppression is a view of U.S. Central Americans as undesirable citizen subjects. Yet this matrix of damaging government-based policies does not account for all the dominant means through which U.S. Central Americans come to be deemed as others. Hegemonic representations of U.S. Central Americans as guerrillas, refugees, domesticas, gang youth, and more broadly, forever illegals, are likewise implicated in this process. See, and I'm sorry, I meant to put these up just previous. So these are some of the policies, and then I'll go into those specific to the Trump era in a later slide. Moving forward. And what you see in this slide here is kind of the basis that I look at for my idea of hegemonic, right? I take that from the notion of hegemonic tropicalizations by Chavez Silverman and Francis Aparicio. And also it's important to note that I foreground this because, there are limits, right, to working with these type of representations. Hegemonic necessarily marginalizes and leaves out quite a bit. So what we are talking about are primarily a certain type of imagined mestizo identity of Central Americans, right? That leaves out indigenous groups, that with very few exceptions, perhaps like El Norte being one of them, right? That leaves out Afro-Central Americans, that leaves out LGBTQ individuals, right? So there are things that I note in the book about these limits, and I talk about a little bit at the conclusion about future possibilities, right? But for the most part, I think there's importance in kind of setting up this foundation, because this is one of the ways in which Central Americans are quote unquote visible, right? If not, as I say, I guess, perhaps not legible, however, right, as Central American. Each of these depictions confer upon U.S. Central Americans different meanings in line with the given historical context and discourses within and through which they have flourished. However, they too also consistently affirm the idea that Central American immigrants and subsequent U.S.-born generations are objectionable citizen subjects. The basis of this objectionability is the presumed threat that these populations pose to the national security and body politic of the nation, as well as the related sense that U.S. Central Americans do not belong in the United States, or in the metacratic logic of neoliberalism, do not deserve to be here and are incapable of being, quote, Americans. Traditional signifiers of immigrant abjection, such as an objectionable race, gender, sexuality, class, and in most cases, the lack of citizenship status, render U.S. Central Americans as such. So too does the link of U.S. Central Americans to the Isthmian region and its perceived backwardness. Capable of individually and collectively signifying U.S. Central Americans as unbelonging subjects, this group of linked depictions can be construed as part of an expanding regime of representation as posited by Stuart Hall in The Spectacle of the Other. Speaking in relation to popular images of Black athletes, Hall explains that even though depictions of these athletes can be interpreted in multiple ways, these images nevertheless say something about the difference and otherness of said individuals. What is communicated about this difference and otherness corresponds with racialized and essentialist discourses, as in the case of stereotypes, and is amplified through intertextuality with other images. The, quote, whole repertoire of such imagery and visual effects, end quote, in a given historical moment is consequently a regime of representation. It is through such regimes that racialized knowledges about the real and symbolic bodies of the other are produced, and as Hall further adds, become naturalized through the circulation of power. Accordingly, the dominant portrayals of U.S. Central Americans in question operate as a regime of representation that has worked to primarily signify and magnify the difference and otherness of Central American populations in the United States. The resulting view of U.S. Central Americans as undesirable and as not belonging within the confines of the nation has been legitimized through the strategic deployment and circulation of these same representations by the U.S. government, the media, and the film publishing industries, among others. Legitimized as such, this knowledge has had and continues to have a direct bearing on the livelihoods of U.S. Central Americans. In short, this seeming truth is a form of symbolic violence directly tied to the systematic efforts to disenfranchise U.S. Central Americans through laws and policy. Yet, as Hall likewise notes, the meanings ascribed to something via representation cannot be fixed, though that is precisely what representation attempts to do. Prevalent and/or privileged forms of meaning can still be unsettled and reappropriated to produce alternate meanings, a process Hall refers to as transcoding. It follows then that these same representations of U.S. Central Americans can also function as discursive sites of negotiation through which to contest prevalent notions of U.S. Central American marginalization and its material effects. An analysis of the ways in which U.S. Central Americans have been prominently depicted as forever illegals in the Trump era helps to illustrate these claims regarding the imbricated work of signification that I argue these representations perform in relation to non-belonging. The forever illegal, a nomenclature inspired by famed poet Roque Dalton's characterization of his Salvadoran compatriots as, quote, los eternos indocumentados, or the internally undocumented, in his love poem or poema de amor, is incarnated in the images of unauthorized Central American men, women, unaccompanied youth, and or family units who are often shown in mass and in dire circumstances, in detention centers, as part of migrant caravans, riding atop of cargo trains to Mexico, seeking asylum as U.S. ports of entry, or stranded and desperate in Mexico. More than underscore the, quote, illegality of the Central American subjects in question, such representations actively participate in its construction. As Nicolas de Genova contends, migrant illegality is as much a product of legal discourses and statutes as it is of spectacles of border enforcement and policing, which are rendered in images and through other visual discourses. Defined first and foremost by their, quote, illegality, these portrayals of Central Americans as forever illegals have the effect of also rendering them a people without a past or a future, a people who have always been and will forever be, quote, illegals. Although not unique to the Trump era, these representations of Central Americans became especially prolific and ubiquitous during it. Among the reasons for this were the Trump administration's anti-immigrant policies and the precarious realities of Central American asylum seekers that provided fodder for such discriminatory efforts, building in some cases on practices established during Barack Obama's presidency. The Trump administration took significant measures to curtail the inflow of undocumented Central American immigrants. In 2017, the administration discontinued the Central American Minors Program that allowed parents living in the United States to request refugee status for their children or relatives living in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. Then in 2018, it adopted a controversial zero-tolerance policy that resulted, among other things, in the forced separation of nearly 5,400 children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. In keeping with the same policy, the administration sought greater legislative power to hold these immigrant families and unaccompanied minors in detention indefinitely, to deny all detainees due process by fast-tracking deportations and bypassing immigrant hearings, and to make it nearly impossible for these immigrants to seek asylum in the United States. In June of 2018, Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced, for instance, that cases based on domestic abuse and gang-related violence, two of the key reasons many of these undocumented Central American immigrants list for fleeing from their home countries, would no longer be considered grounds for seeking asylum in the United States. This shift in asylum policy was followed in 2019 by the implementation of two other restrictive measures meant to impede undocumented migrants from seeking asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border: the migration protocols, or Remain in Mexico program, and the third country asylum rule. Whereas the first measure requires that asylum seekers remain in Mexico while their case is adjudicated, the second mandates that they need to apply for asylum in a country they transit through before seeking it in the United States. The outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020 led to related measures by the Trump administration to further block the entry of these asylum seekers, including closing the US-Mexico and US-Canadian borders to all non-essential travel and suspending indefinitely immigration proceedings for individuals forced to wait in Mexico. And if you keep up with the news, right, you will know that a lot of these policies it's been difficult to undo them the way that they have been established. And in some cases, right, the Biden administration has kept them in place. Such actions to block undocumented Central Americans from coming into the United States through the legal means of asylum were coupled by similarly alarming efforts to disenfranchise and eventually expunge from the country portions of the U.S. Central American population shielded under DACA and TPS. Recipients from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras rank within the top 5 of all DACA populations. The Trump administration's decision to rescind the program in 2017 threatened the livelihoods and futures not only of these recipients, but also that of their families, including their US-born children and spouses. The administration's related move in late 2019 to terminate the temporary protected status of just over 250,000 Central Americans, some of which have resided in the country for over 20 years, similarly put at risk the socioeconomic existence and emotional well-being of these immigrants and their families. Further contributing to the proliferation of these images of Central Americans as forever illegals is their symbolic currency. On one hand, these renderings can inspire sympathy for and galvanize sectors of the U.S. public on behalf of undocumented Central Americans and their plight. On the other hand, they can be used to affirm racist and xenophobic notions about the looming threat that these populations pose to the national and economic security of the United States. A significant case in point are the quote caravans of Central American migrants that captured Trump's and the nation's attention in 2018. Trump first referenced the caravans on April 1st, 2018, in a tweet in which he also railed against the weak immigration laws of Democrats and a potential deal on DACA. The program established the executive decision by his predecessor, Barack Obama, in 2012, and which Trump similarly ended through executive action in 2017. With 2 short phrases amid these other attacks, quote, getting more dangerous, caravans coming, Trump painted an image of the Central American migrants en route as a multiplying and violent horde on a collision course with the United States. This image belied the fact that these caravans were part of an organized effort by the immigrant rights organization Pueblos Sin Fronteras to help undocumented Central Americans migrate safely and seek asylum in Mexico and the United States, and were not a new phenomenon. This was a calculated strategy employed by Trump in the months leading up to the midterm elections in November 2018. Recalling Reagan's anti-communist discourse in relation to the threat of communism and immigration from Central America, Trump played into the racialized fears of terrorist attacks and demographic shifts of his Republican base, fears he continued to stoke with subsequent tweets in which he suggested that the caravan had been infiltrated by, quote, many gang members and some very bad people, and by his controversial decision right before the elections to deploy 5,200 active duty troops to the southern border, adding to the 2,100 National Guards members that had already been mobilized. Despite some pushback within the mainstream media, Trump's theatrics of fear did impact public opinion concerning Central American migrants. As a Monmouth University poll from November revealed, more than half of those surveyed considered the migrant caravan as either a major or minor threat to the country. Another notable instance of the discursive power of such images is the widely circulated photograph of a Honduran woman and her 5-year-old twin daughters fleeing tear gas near the border on Tijuana, Mexico, also taken in 2018. Identified by reporters as Maria Lila Mesa Castro, the woman in the photograph and her 5 children, only 2 of which appeared in the photograph, were among a group of Central American migrants who had been barred from seeking asylum in the United States for weeks and forced to wait in Mexico. The U.S. Border Patrol responded to a collective effort by the frustrated group of migrants to access the ports of entry and enter the country through other means by attacking the group with tear gas and rubber bullets. Like similar images of Central American children held in detention centers, separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border, or who drowned alongside their parents while attempting to cross the Rio Grande, this photograph taken by Reuters photographer Kim Young-hoon also stoked public outrage. In the image, Castro appears mid-flight, frantically dragging her meagerly clothed daughters, Zaira and Chelly, alongside her. Clad only in t-shirts and pull-up diapers, one of the girls wears flip-flops while the other lacks shoes entirely. Castro wears a t-shirt that prominently displays the characters from the Disney movie Frozen, an ironic detail often noted in articles concerning the tear gassing incident. Near the frightened family lies a canister of tear gas from which white smoke rises, and beyond that are other migrants also running or standing in groups, as if just realizing what is occurring around them. Many of these clusters of migrants remain near the red border gate and barbed wire fencing that can also be seen in the background. Writing for The Intercept, Natasha Leonard suggests that what made the photograph disturbing to so many people was not the fact that the use of violence against immigrants at the border or of tear gas against the disenfranchised and minority groups by the US government were new occurrences, but rather that, quote, visual representations of such violence at the border have proven rare. Leonard likewise observed that for all its potential to fuel public condemnation of the Trump administration's actions against Central American asylum seekers, the photograph could just as easily be seen as playing into the narrative pushed by the administration of the US-Mexico border as a, quote, immigrant crisis zone that requires militarized intervention and tighter regulations. This interpretive and symbolic fluidity makes the representations of US Central Americans as forever illegals reminiscent of those of war-torn refugees in the 1980s, which also revolved around notions of them as victims of US immigration and foreign policies, and alternately as threats to the country. So you'll recall some of the earlier slides, I had an image from like Oliver Stone's really famous movie Salvador that had the character played by the actress Elvira Carrillo. Prominent depictions of Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum seekers in cinema and literary works of the period attempted to render them victims worthy of sympathy and safe haven, thereby providing a counterpoint to other views of them as contaminated by communism or as subversives. However, in so doing, many of these same efforts also depicted these refugees as ill-equipped to adapt and thrive in the United States due to their traumas and or lack of modernity, a troubling fact given the contemporaneous neoliberal turn in immigration policy of the time. As Leah Perry contends, the Reagan era marked the beginning of a decided shift from what had been a view of the United States as a, quote, nation of immigrants that welcomed and aided newcomers to that of a country in the throes of a, quote, immigration emergency, in which individual responsibility and immigrant merit mattered most. These imaginings of Central American refugees that underscored their failure to transcend their seeming brokenness and backwardness, thus cast these populations as incompatible with the emerging neoliberal paradigm of immigrant desirability and inclusion. Visual representations of these same political refugees by sympathetic US activists were no less problematic. Like the photograph of Castro and her young daughters and countless others, they also tended to focalize images of women and children, the intended result of which was to make these populations appear less threatening by framing them as generally feminized and infantile. Akin to literary depictions, such visual renderings also robbed asylum seekers of agency and called into question their ability to thrive in the United States. The figure of the forever illegal evokes this idea of victimization and dependency with one added nuance. The, quote, illegality that is front and center in this representation of US Central Americans occludes their histories and experiences as undocumented immigrants. Few, if any, of the news reports that featured Castro's image or referenced her story of migration, few, if any, of the news reports that featured Castro's image referenced her story of migration. Other than to note that she was hoping to reach her husband in Louisiana, these media accounts failed to address what she had endured en route to the United States with her 5 children, or while forced to wait in Mexico at a makeshift camp for asylum seekers. Nor was there any mention of the reasons that drove her to leave Honduras. Unlike the 1980s, reporting about the reality on the ground in Central America driving these new waves of refugees is scant. Notably for undocumented immigrants like Castro, such a recognition of the dangerous conditions they are fleeing is critical to their claims for asylum and to being seen as more than just, quote, illegals invading the country. And, when they do report the reality on the ground, it's usually related to gang violence, right? But then gang violence is really disarticulated from history, right? There's no context for understanding, our immigration policy's role in creating these kind of transnational gang movements, right? These hegemonic depictions of Central American asylum seekers as forever illegals are not going uncontested. U.S. Central Americans and others are pushing back against such portrayals and complicating them by providing needed and liking context as well as alternate representations. And they are often doing so through a reworking of these very representations and by evoking notions of belonging as an instantiation of being as enacted within the margins and as possibility. Javier Zamora's poem, Second Attempt Crossing, helps to substantiate this point. The latter is part of Zamora's poetry collection, Unaccompanied, which draws, among other things, on his experiences as an undocumented and unaccompanied youth who migrated to the United States when he was 9 years old. The poem recalls an instance during the poet's migrant journey when La Migra unexpectedly descended upon the group of migrants with which he was traveling, prompting them to frantically scatter in different directions. One of the migrants, named Chino, to whom the poem is dedicated, used his body to shield the poet from the blows of the immigration officers that captured them. The poet expresses regret at never having thanked, quote, beautiful Chino for his actions and proceeds to reveal who this individual was in the final verses, a former member of MS-13 who was fleeing the gang and who, even after they had both parted ways once in the United States, continued to call the poet twice a month until his former gang found him. As such, the last verses of the poem also constitute a tender tribute and farewell to someone the poet viewed as a protector. The poet writes, farewell your tattooed chest, the M, the S, the 13, farewell the phone number you gave me when you went east to Virginia and I went west to San Francisco, farewell your brown arms that shielded me then, that shield me now from La Migra. And I want to note that this image, right, is one of the many, I can't recall if I took it from the New York Times or the LA Times. And I often struggle with putting these images because I think they're so fetishized, right, in the media. But I think it is important to juxtapose, right, the way the images in the media kind of work in relation to how Zamora is positioning, right, the subjectivity of Chino. So to create that kind of contrast. Zamora's endearing portrait of Chino stands in sharp contrast to the dominant image of the threatening and violent MS-13 gang member cultivated in mainstream media and used so effectively by the Trump administration to push its hardline agenda on immigration. Rendered through the eyes of the poet and a fellow unaccompanied minor, Chino is not a monster. He is beautiful, a caring individual who looked after the poet during and after their migratory journey, even though he too was another frightened youth traveling alone in search of refuge in the United States. By representing Chino in this manner, the poet likewise offers a counter-narrative to the dominant and often vacuous depictions of Central American subjects as forever illegals. The victimization of unaccompanied youth like the poet and Chino is not the prime focus of this poem. Rather, the significant and lasting bond forged between them amid their otherwise alienating existence. This instantiation of belonging enacted by two Central American migrant subjects presumed to be undesirable works to both humanize them and make the realities more legible. In closing, I would like to offer one last example of a counter-narrative to the Central American inflected trope of the forever illegal, which predates the Trump era, but nevertheless is an important contribution to this discussion. The image you see is that of an untitled installation piece by a self-described Guatemalan Angelino street artist that goes by the name of Caché, pronounced Caché in keeping with the Spanish pronunciation of the French cachet. The vibrant murals of political yet whimsical cartoon chickens by this local graffiti artist turned street muralist have become a well-known staple of the Silver Lake and Echo Park neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Inspired by Carlos Castaneda's theory of humaneros or human coops, Caches chickens are visual metaphors for humans who are trapped in the coop of a socially and economically stratified society that is largely driven by consumerism and that emphasizes uniformity. His murals speak to both the oppressive reality of this entrapment and the possibility of fighting against it, whether the chickens depicted are white, rotund, and cute, or more humanized and multi-hued or brown. The latter recalling chicken breeds used in the poultry industry. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So these are kind of like the brown chickens. Also, my last slide, I'll show you an image of one of his graffiti murals that I also discussed. Thus, it is not uncommon to see Caches chickens partaking in anti-government forms of resistance, as was the case with anti-war rallies and Occupy LA marches. Alongside a black-clad cartoon Zapatista, a symbol of popular struggle in the Americas, and the signature character of fellow street artist I1. Nor is it unusual to see these same birds standing defiantly, in some cases even thrusting a clenched fist in the air, while rising above the bubbly murkiness and the far-reaching mechanical tentacles of society that threaten to encase them. Though different in both form and means of exhibition, this piece nevertheless retains Caches' trademark, a cartoon chicken. This three-dimensional installation fashioned out of papier-mâché, sculptures, and other household materials was featured in the By the Time I Get to Arizona show held at the Mid-City Arts Gallery in June 2010, a show organized in response to Arizona's controversial Senate Bill 1070, the Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act. The bill made it a state crime to be in the country illegally and required police officials to check the immigration status of any individual they suspect of being undocumented. And as opponents of the bill rightfully pointed out, it is a measure that violates civil rights as it leads to racial profiling and is a targeted attack against Mexicans and other Latino populations. Like many of the other pieces by fellow street artists on display in the exhibit, Caches' installation speaks to the exclusionary politics and racism at the center of Arizona's bill. The white picket fence, which conjures an image of the predominantly Anglo-suburban neighborhoods of 1950s America, seemingly when, quote, America was great, underscores the perceived need for protection from the threat of criminal, quote, illegal aliens and the attempt to preserve what is, quote, ours. The wooden barrier protects what it fences in, the cornerstone of, quote, America's way of life, the American dream, whilst also establishing a territorial, cultural, and racial boundary for would-be trespassers and unwanted guests. Moreover, in using the metaphor of a hamburger, a highly commercialized form of fast food, and in this installation, bait for a mousetrap, Cache also forces viewers to consider the nature of the American way of life, an ideal of success that U.S. citizens protect so vehemently and undocumented migrants risk their own lives to attain. Along with this political statement, Cache's work also can be understood as a commentary concerning Central American undocumented migration and labor exploitation. Cache's portrayal of the undocumented migratory subject as a brown chicken insinuates a link between this subject and the meatpacking and poultry industry. It likewise hints at the important gendered dimensions of such a relationship. As noted previously, this brown chicken calls to mind breeds such as Isa Browns that are genetically engineered hybrids for the purpose of egg laying, and others that are grown specifically for their meat. A high premium is placed on females given their capabilities as reproducers of marketable goods, their eggs. Ironically, in this case, the chicken represented by Cache does not necessarily evoke the product itself, but rather the cheap and highly productive workforce needed to guarantee its production. This is a workforce that in recent decades has not only become increasingly Mexican and Central American, but also more female. And it's something, of course, that, I'm much more familiar with in Northwest Arkansas and Fayetteville, where, the attraction to the poultry industry, right? It's home to Tyson Foods. And so we have very much a Central American community based on that pool. This seeming reference to the growing female presence within the poultry industry adds further nuance to the broader critique made via this installation piece regarding the exploitation of undocumented Central American workers. Women employed in poultry plants are generally responsible for some of the most physically taxing and hazardous forms of assembly line work, including having to hang, slice open, and empty chicken carcasses of their entrails at high speeds and in substandard working conditions. The intense and debilitating nature of this work is made more acute by abuses of supervisorial power aimed especially at women, such as sexual harassment and being paid lower wages. Like the Isa Brown breeds CASWG chicken in this installation piece recalls, women employed in these plants are expected to be high producers, valued only for how quickly and efficiently they can move products through the processing line. Within what is already a disenfranchised population of undocumented workers who lack citizenship-based rights, immigrant women find themselves even more stigmatized and subordinated on account of their gender. The successful functioning of the agricultural industry depends on the purposeful obscuring and docility of the broader undocumented immigrant workforce it employs. Were this necessary invisibility to be compromised, however, undocumented Central Americans would indeed be seen, but only as criminal, quote, illegal aliens. Highly publicized events such as the 2008 immigration raid at the kosher meatpacking plant, Agri-Processors Inc. in Postville, Iowa, is a case in point. Embedded in an alternative narrative of immigrant labor exploitation, CASWG's installation piece becomes an expression of another key facet of the Central American immigrant experience in the United States. It reveals the contradictory positioning of Central Americans as, on one hand, visible, quote, illegal aliens, and on the other, invisible laborers maintained as such by the regimes of government, law, and the agricultural industry. Such an act of exposure is both a reputation of the figure of the forever illegal and its means of othering U.S. Central Americans, and a claim to visibility that, like Zamora's portrait of Chino, gives the Central American immigrant subject context and imbues her with humanity. As I've intended to show via my book project and this related presentation, contemplating hegemonic representations of U.S. Central Americans as critical incursions into a larger U.S. Central American experience allows for the focalization of U.S. Central American experiences of crossing and subjectivities that are, to a great extent, rendered illegible and of less critical import under an enduring, quote, first world gaze, and by blanket notions of Latin American immigration and who and what are, quote, illegals. In essence, my work pushes back against the erasure of Central Americanness and its differences within regimenting public discourses and academic approaches to immigration related to Latinx peoples. By the same token, this work also complicates dominant conceptualizations and debates regarding Latin American immigration and insists on the need to reframe them altogether. The nuances of Central American border crossings and immigrant lives can only be ascertained and addressed by looking beyond the limits of the U.S.-Mexico divide and its borderlands. It is not enough to only contend with the bilateral relationships of the United States and Mexico and the United States and Central America. We also need a complex understanding of multi-state securitization, economic and foreign policies, as well as the added intersectional power dynamics at various levels that define Mexican and Central American relations dating back to the colonial period. Attention to such nuances is necessary for contemplating the subjectivities and lived experiences of U.S. Central Americans. Ultimately, and consistent with related scholarship by U.S. Central American scholars working in a similar vein, and the scholarship that's yet to come by all of you participating, this study is both a renewed call to rethink and reconfigure Latinx studies and a testament to some of the ways that change is already underway. And with that, I thank you all and welcome questions. And below in this image, you can see that's one of CASWG's murals. It's one that I work on, and it's one that's still there. Like I just visited like about a week ago. It's changed slightly, but it's still there. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so I can see everybody's faces and we can start our conversation.
Thank you so much, Yajaira, for that. That was really great, Dr. Padilla. And, you know, you've given us so much to think about. And, you know, a couple of us have been talking about these things, you know, just in our private conversations, and you've really helped us, you know, give us some language to really continue to keep thinking through a lot of, you know, issues that affect Central Americans, you know, here in the United States and on the Isthmus. So yeah, we're going to continue with Q&A. a couple of us in the Central American Studies Working Group have had the opportunity to read the book, which has been great. So we have formulated a few questions. We're going to go ahead and ask the questions that we came up with as a group. And then we do want to open it up to audience members to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, please send those to me directly, privately through the chat, and then I will read them aloud for everyone. So the first question is, so the 1980s has been fundamentally central to Central American studies, often serving as a focal point to theorize Central American experiences. How do you think the contemporary context that creates the forever illegal trope might shift this focal point? So in other words, what changes in Central American studies, if anything, when the forever illegal is the main protagonist rather than the threatening guerrilla or political refugee?
So I thank you for that thoughtful question. I think if I may, I might push back a little bit on it in the sense of the notion that it is true the 1980s is fundamentally important, but I don't know, that enough has been done from that viewpoint to theorize Central American studies in many ways. And I say that because I think that, one of the things that I was trying to do precisely was with the book is make those connections, right? Is to kind of showcase that the forever illegal or these representations are not new. They're different manifestations of what has already existed. And that's one of the interventions I'm trying to make is kind of, we need to make these connections and cover this ground historically, so that we can properly contextualize and kind of move forward with the possibilities of what something like the forever legal could be, right? When I conceived of these kind of tropes or whatever you want, I just made, I was like, I've seen these before, but I see these conversations happening now. And maybe because that was when I was being brought up and growing up, right? That was the context, but I see the conversation happen now. And I just wanted to make that connection to be like, no, this is not in a vacuum, right? This is not in a vacuum. And so my hope would be that, there's going to be newer directions and possibilities for this context now, but my hope would be that it's rooted also with an understanding that it doesn't come from the ether, nor is it new, right? It might have, like I said, a different nuance to it, right? A different dimension, because each context is a historical era or moment is different. But in a sense, it's not necessarily, I guess the point was to make, it's not necessarily the new definitive trope, right? And there will be something else that comes through it, but the point was to kind of show that. Does that make sense? So I think that in many ways, it will shift the focal point, but my hope is that it also kind of invites an understanding of the past too. So it's not just the future that we're moving toward.
Thank you. And then we also wanted to ask, what intervention do you think the paradigm of non-belonging is making into Central American studies? So where do you think the lens of non-belonging can be used outside of the scope of the book? I'm guessing more, where do you hope this idea of non-belonging or concept of non-belonging takes us?
Well, I mean, one of the things I think, one of the conversations I've been having really is, when I started the book was almost 10 years ago, right? So there was a kind of a different, slightly different conversation. There was a conversation, I think, of more of the, like I mentioned, more like the ways in which we don't belong, right? But there's so much more now in terms of how we do belong, right? And the ways in which we have been belonging. And that's something that I wish, I think I would have developed more, but it's something that I hope is taken up, that as we move forward, there's a lot more of the belonging that's brought in and how that counteracts in two ways, not just the way you resist that position of not belonging, but also the multiple ways in which we do belong. Because I think there's a sense, I talk about it briefly in the book, but I think we also equate this idea of belonging as resistance, right? Against this kind of marginalization. But there's a lot of belonging, and I look at it in like earlier generations, I look at it with my parents that really embrace an Americanness an American, like a lot of these kind of discourses that are problematic, right? And you even see that now in a lot of the kind of hopes and aspirations for immigrants making journeys. That discourse is still very prevalent. So you have a kind of branding of an unquestioned Americanness in some ways. And I think that also has to be part of the conversation, right? I'm also hoping that, this is something that allows us to talk about with other racialized group and ethnic immigrant groups. I think about that in terms of Asian Americans, where I see a lot of parallels in terms of the heterogeneity, right? And in terms of the histories. In fact, when I was thinking about through these paradigms, I read a lot of work on Asian American communities. I really liked Espiritu's Body Counts, right? As one of them, where she's talking about Asian American refugees. And so I think my hope would be that there's connections and that this might open a conversation to, even though I focus a lot more with kind of the question of immigration, that these are conversations for thinking about what non-belonging looks like with second generations, right? Third generations, 1.5 generations. Does that change as we integrate more, right? Like what, and what does that, the aspirations to belonging, do they change? Right? Because they do. So, I think this is something you never know, when you propose these models. For me, it was the model that best captured what I was thinking about at the time and best allowed me to work through the questions I had, but it may or may not take. I welcome the debate, right? And I welcome the engagement and I welcome the critique of the model, but hopefully with the idea that it will, as long as it keeps the dialogue and the conversation going. So that is kind of, my hope is that it continues to fuel other possibilities of thinking through and other models for how we conceive of the discipline, but how we conceive of ourselves, because we're so multifaceted and heterogeneous, right?
Thank you for that, Yajaira. And I think that kind of maybe leads us into the next question that I wanted to ask. That's a little bit about positionality, but also a little bit about maybe the future directions of Central American studies. So, I mean, right now you were sort of talking about the way that maybe different generations might think about belonging or conceive of Central Americanness. So for me, one of the things that I kept thinking about as I read your book, especially with the emergence of forever illegal as a new trope, but also the fact that you kind of lay out this new demographic profile of Central Americans as one that's characterized primarily by undocumented communities or TPS, sort of liminal status DACA recipients. So I'm wondering how we might recognize that the forever illegal is not only like a trope or a community that we need to study, but also people that are scholars or theorizing this as well, if that makes sense. Because I'm, as a DACA recipient, I'm also in conversations where undocumented scholars are trying to kind of assert themselves as more than objects within the literature that has happened in migration studies. So I'm wondering how we might kind of try to do that in Central American studies, or do it in a way where Central American studies doesn't fall into the trap of kind of thinking that the people that we study are also not people that are thinking about this alongside them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And thank you for that nuanced question. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, and I apologize that it's on my shelf, but I haven't read it, is Lacey Abrego's and Negron Gonzalez's book, We Are Not Dreamers, right? That they, that the kind of is pushing back precisely on that question, right? Of positionality, subjectivity. But I think it also implies questioning the frameworks that set us up in these positions to begin with, right? So the idea of who, right? Or who is a theorizing subject, right? Which is not a new question either. It makes me think about, my roots in third world women feminism and thinking about Chicanx feminism and Latinx feminism, which is the beginning of who are theorizing subjects who are recognized. So there's another thing too within the academy, who are recognized as theorizing subjects, right? And who are the object of study. And so I think it isn't just enough to, to announce this is my position and I'm not just an object study, but actually to try to, deconstruct and kind of question what is the framework that position us already in these kind of like limited, right? Makes us these limited subjects or puts us in these silos from which we can't speak. And that, I mean, that's one thing that I can fundamentally think about. And the other question would be a question that we've been debating for a long time, even before us, right? Which is, what is theory? Right? What is theory? And so, and what is it grounded in? But I do have a caveat to thinking about that, right? Because I do think that the idea of theory shifts. I mean, there's obviously the notion of, I think about this when I teach my own graduate students and in my own classes, when we begin fundamentally by, trying to read, theorists of color alongside other theory, and reading women of color, quote unquote, theorists, right? And why is it that certain people are recognized as theorists and others are not, right? So for instance, I have my students read, Gender Trouble by Judith Butler alongside Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands. Both are published the same year, but there's these different recognitions or different pathways in which, these theorists have arrived in their place. And I say the caveat because I do think that, I do think it's important to talk about theory and theory from like our everyday lives. I do think it's grounded though, right? I do still think there's methodology, right, involved in how we do that and kind of a practice of it. And in grounding it. So I say this because, for instance, I don't want to imply that like, you say one thing and then all of a sudden you're like, well, this is theory without whole, historic facts or historicity. I do think there's a methodology implied even as you're theorizing about your lives. And that doesn't mean that, there isn't people that outside of the academy. In fact, I think there's a lot of theorists outside of the academy. The issue is bridging those gaps. And the issue is also, the structures established by the academy, right? That enables, that decides that. I guess what I'm saying is we have to create a path in which we can be the decision makers as well, not just a resistance to like, so shift the actual framing of the question. So we're not responding just to the question. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah.
So this next question is from Sofia Ordaz. She's asking, Dr. Padilla commented on representations of Central Americans and U.S. Central Americans as visibilizing but not always legible, which contributes to the non-belonging and even invisibility of Central Americans in the mainstream cultural fabric of the U.S. Scholars like Arturo Arias have written about the traumatic experiences many Central American migrants lived through in the 80s through to the present day, contributes to a desire to pass under the radar to invisibilize themselves. What do you think? What do you make of this thinking? How might trauma and intergenerational trauma contribute to the invisibility of Central Americans? To zoom out further, how might the high saturation of media and pop culture representations of Central American migrants in crisis contribute, if at all, to a desire to stay invisible or to steer clear from the crosshairs of white supremacy?
Okay, so I cut my Wi-Fi cut out, but I captured a little bit. And so there's two things I want to say. I think there's two things being put together here, right? So, or being overlapped, and I think they need to be unpacked. So one is like, Arias's understanding of invisibility due to kind of the claiming right in the 80s, as he makes, of claiming Mexicanness, right, to kind of to protect themselves. But he's also making a larger claim about invisibility in terms of identity politics, right? Of talking about that, in his term, Central American Americans, right? It's not his term, it's actually Maya Chinchilla's term, but in his adoption of that term, right? Haven't yet arrived, right, to the point of having this identity politics, right? That's one thing. What I'm stating is kind of making the case that, I'm looking at representation in terms of like, we are visible. I'm not talking necessarily about identity politics. I'm talking about the everyday instances in which we are visible. And I'm making the case that we have been visible. The problem is the way we have been made visible, right? By structures of power and particular agencies, right? And that what that means is that there is a certain type of meaning ascribed to us, which that's where I go and say, which makes us illegible, right? Because it's not us telling our own stories. We're being put into kind of certain type of scripts, certain guided scripts and meaning making that actually are not invested, like that last image that I put, right, of the Honduran woman, right, of Ms. Castro, that are not as invested in thinking about what are the actual experiences, what are the histories, right, what are the traumas. And so in that sense, I am kind of slightly arguing a different context than Aria, but in some way pushing back against his notion too, and the way that his idea of invisibility has been used quite a bit to say, okay, we're all invisible, right? Which is not necessarily the case, right? That there is, that is kind of his notion of invisibility to me is much more like of a kind of a paradigm that he's using to talk about in different ways. And so I think they're connected, but I see them as slightly different things. And yes, there is a valid and legitimate reason why Central Americans wouldn't claim their Central Americanness, right, in that particular context, or even now, right? But I do think that I'm trying to articulate something slightly different in terms of illegibility, where I'm making the case that this is about erasing certain experiences, right? And making us visible in such a way that described in the book I talk about is a kind of paradoxical visibility, right? We are visible, but only very specific ways, and ways that actually erase us and actually are really problematic, right? That fuel the kind of stigmatization of our communities that lead to these other very negative, right, and traumatic effects. Does that make sense?
And then the next question is from Eileen Galvez. In the book, you cited Arturo Arias' writing on non-belonging and invisibility. At the time that Arias wrote this, he also writes that U.S. Central Americans have not really found an identity. Reading on your writings on non-belonging felt so similar, and yet this moment feels so significant in U.S. Central American belonging. What happens to that non-belongingness if it is divorced from Latinidad? Is that even possible?
Well, okay, so I followed the question up to the last part. Like, Eileen, can you explain what you mean by when it's divorced from Latinidad?
Yeah, Eileen, you can hop in.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was more so thinking how I'm actually currently reading that text on Arias, and he brings in Latinidad and how we're on the margins of the margins, and that it wasn't really actually constructed for us, but we're encapsulated in it. And so I was wondering, not that I didn't mean to say that you and his writing were the same. I meant more so, I'm trying to reread my own question. So he was saying that U.S. Central Americans hadn't really found an identity. They were scared, for all sorts of reasons. They hadn't really found that. And in this moment, it feels like a moment where we're coming together and we're trying to figure out what this pan-ethnicity thing means. And I'm wondering, are we able to find belonging if we take our need to be Latinos out of the question? If that makes sense.
Like in relation, okay, now I understand, like in relation to Latinidad? Because I mean,
like if we're not concerned about needing to belong in Latinidad, can we find belonging space in Central Americanness?
Completely. I mean, don't we already? I mean, I guess this is why I wanted to clarify too, that at least the way I understand it, I know there's others here that like will, have been in this conversation as well. He is trying to make that case in relation to Latinidad, right? And in relation to Latino identity politics, and in relation to a hyphen. In fact, a lot of us don't talk about a hyphen. That isn't. So that is kind of the paradigm with which he was working with. And there has been pushback against that paradigm, right? I mean, I'm not the first, and actually, I think Ana Patricia Rodriguez has said this quite plainly. We are visible. I mean, so the pushback against invisibility, right? I think you can parallel it to what I kind of mentioned, that I do believe that there's several ways in which we don't belong, which is what I wanted to showcase so that we can work on the ways in which we can belong and showing those. But those have always been happening too, right? It's not to say that they're happening in like a linear fashion, right? Those happen at the same time that non-belonging happens, which is why I wanted to show those instances of belonging within the margins, right? Or a response. So I would say, yeah, because I think that if we think about also just questions of like identity, we have multiple positionalities. So I can clearly, like, I'm in Los Angeles right now, visiting my family. I clearly feel that I belong here independent of being Latina, because there's a Central American community here that I don't have to position myself, right? I don't have to kind of explain where within the Latino scope I fit, you know? But I do think that it is relational. And I do think you can find that sense of belonging independent of it, but it depends on what the argument and what the context is, right? If I'm, so instance, and I think Eileen, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but here in the South, I have to make the case, right, of my relationship to Latinidad, just because the understanding of, you know, Latinx identity or Latinidad is very much in creation in this particular part of the South. There's other parts where it's growing and has a longer history, but in this particular part of the South, right, where it's, you know, Mexican dominant, immigrant dominant, with a very growing Central American immigrant dominant component, which is not the case in all spaces. So I would say that, yes, I do think in a very practical way it is. And I do think that you can make the case. However, I would also add that precisely because I'm attempting to, you know, create this conversation with Latinx studies and think about reframing, that it is imperative for me to position what I'm trying to do in the book in relation to that, right? Yeah, so I'll leave it.
Okay, and I just wanted to open it up. If anyone has any more questions, you can feel free to either jump in right now at this moment, or if you want to write a question in the chat box, I can go ahead and read it for you. I have a question. This comes from Paula Ayala. I would like to further problematize the visibility you have highlighted. Sorry. I would like to further problematize the visibility you have highlighted. What are some transgressive actions, so community and academically, that you can see for actual Central Americans who are witnessing the exploitation of sympathy through these tropes by non-Central Americans for reasons of capital, social, economic, symbolic, etc.?
Okay, can you read that again? I'm sorry. Or place it, is it in the chat? Or no? So, I mean, I think, okay, thank you for that question. I think academically, I think our work is part of that, right? I think that our work is a transgressive act, as it may not seem like it, but the fact that we exist in these spaces is transforming, right? The fact that you're having this conversation is transformative. And I say this as someone who, you know, like I'm sure some of you grew up in Southern California, and whose presence, right, it's a Chicanx dominant space, right? And who had to kind of constantly fight to carve out, and kind of just the nature of saying I'm not Mexican, right? Or I'm not Chicanx was in itself felt like a transgressive act, because it wasn't always met kindly, right? Or it was, you know, why not? the question was, well, why not? Why don't you feel, or why don't you identify, right? And this kind of context explanation. And going through my own doctor program, going through my assistant professorship, my associate, that has continued. It has always been a case to have to defend why I study Central Americans, right? And kind of how I position myself in relation to that. So I do think that's a transgressive act. In terms of like, and I see that the same way in community. I think the other thing, and perhaps this might be a little old school, and perhaps this is just my own academic training, but I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge about our communities, right? I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge and a lot of lack of history in terms of our communities. And I think that that also is a good way to resist what is that kind of exploitation of sympathy through these tropes. Because as I mentioned in the book, that is obviously the sympathy appropriation. It always appears disarticulated from history. It's not like they're providing any grounding of history, you know, or there's another example, for example, that I talk about in the book, or it becomes something that I think I mentioned, like an episode of like the series Bones, in which they do talk about the history of like Central America, but it becomes the subject that merits empathy from viewers becomes the white protagonist, right? So they appropriate the sympathy. And if you don't have these historical groundings, right? If you don't push back with kind of certain facts from our own voices, then I think it makes it a lot easier to have, you know, that appropriation of sympathy, right? Because it's kind of just in the ether, right? And I mean, that happens with a lot of groups. So, you know, in addition to what is like the kind of basic, you know, it's our kind of voices adding to the conversation, I do think what we say matters, right? And how we push back on that. And I think part of that is that, and let me see, is there another, Nancy, I'll let you go ahead and read it if you want.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat. Your talk centered Trump over Obama in terms of how the more openly neo-fascist president helps produce the narratives you describe. Yet at the level of the Central American child and mother's body, Obama started the US on the journey of caging and separating and jailing Central American child and mother bodies. How does Obama and the refusal to acknowledge his fascistic treatment of Central American children and contribute to the dynamics you described?
Oh, completely. I mean, in the talk, you know, I talk about the two kind of cornerstone presidencies, but I would say not only Obama, but Clinton, you know, like it's not like, you know, you have this kind of 20 years of both centrist Democrats who, you know, kind of build upon, right? And Republican, and Bush, but they all build upon the same. It's not like, if we remember, you know, Obama is, you know, the deporter in chief. And I pass over it quickly, but it is, you know, he tried to dismantle the Flores Amendment, right? He just wasn't able to do it. But those set these grounds for what are Trump's policies. And I mentioned it perhaps just in passing, but in the book, I talk about it a little bit more and actually add to more in endnotes. But you are correct in terms of, I think that each of those presidencies, that's why I marked from Reagan, you know, Bush, Clinton, Obama to Trump. This is kind of a general shift that begins with Reagan, but it's kept up by, you know, the subsequent administrations in terms of immigration policy and in terms of neoliberalism, because what I'm saying is this is a kind of neoliberal approach to immigration, and they've all embraced it. And it all, yes, he sets the precedent in many ways for what are, you know, the much more openly embraced that Trump, as you well put it. But I don't mean to imply, you know, that there is, I think there has been, because people don't want to talk about, but his Obama, where you say that the kind of refusal to acknowledge his fascistic treatment, it's very on point, right? Obama definitely has some problem. And if you think about, you know, like I said, the deporter in chief, and as I mentioned, I think and I have a whole chapter where I look at kind of Clinton a bit more, because I think they all structure it. In the nature of my talk, I'm kind of interested again with making those links between Reagan and Trump, because again, to show that this is not new, it's just taking a different hue, but I don't ignore what's happened in between there. I know, and certainly I don't mean to imply that Obama doesn't have an important role, because he has, and he's got an extremely problematic record on immigration. And without kind of the moves he made, some of the policies that Trump actually just exploited and moved forward wouldn't have been possible. So that is, so I guess just to say, I very much agree with your question and the statement made. I hear you. Yeah, there's still very much a stigma to criticizing, right? Obama, right? Especially in these very divided times. But as I tell my students, I've spoken to people, Obama is very much a centrist and very much embraces these policies. So the kind of that binaryism isn't exact, right? Isn't exact. Oh yeah, child separation, but also, I mean, this happened during the war too, right? This is also not new. This is also not new.
So I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Padilla, for having this conversation with us. I'm sure everyone feels here too that you've given us so much to think about. We're really appreciative of your time.
Thank you to everybody here. I'm glad. And feel free to, reach out or email me if you want to continue the conversation, or if you have further questions, I'd be happy to do so. I really appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
Bye, everyone.